Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education. Jerri, we started this podcast, Breaking Boundaries in Education, in the middle of the pandemic.
We did.
So we really were focusing on those stories of resiliency and how we can fight back and learn and grow. There's been so much. And now we have some guests today who are taking a retrospective look on those challenges and how we grew from those and how schools have actually leveraged all those challenges. So I'm looking forward to hearing from them today.
Yes, Jamie. So we actually have Susan Enfield back. She has been here before talking about relationships and making sure that every student is seen, heard, and valued in the district. But she's bringing with her her co-author, Kristi Wilson. And both of these incredible ladies were superintendents during the pandemic. And they got together after the pandemic, in retrospect, as you said earlier, Jamie, to look at what superintendents did during that pandemic and give people, a behind the curtain look. I think people think that superintendents are just reacting all the time, but they were being proactive and doing so much work behind the scenes. So they have a book, and I love the title of the book, On Fire, Under Fire, or Fired. And it seems like that's really one of the three categories superintendents ended up in during the pandemic. So Susan and Kristi, we welcome you to the LinkedUp podcast. We're happy to have you here, and we are very excited to hear about your book. So Susan, I know you have a new position. You want to introduce yourself, tell us what you're up to, and then we'll have Kristi follow.
Sure. So again, Jamie and Jerri, it's nice to be back. Thank you for having us. We're very excited to be here. I am a former English ELL and journalism teacher who I jokingly say lost my way and found myself in the superintendency and spent 13 years serving as a superintendent in Seattle Public Schools, Highline Public Schools, and Washoe County Public Schools, School District rather, in Reno, Nevada. And as of July 1, I will be the executive director for the Center for Educational Leadership at the University of Washington.
Oh, very nice. Excited for you on this new journey. Thank you, Susan. And Kristi, tell us about yourself.
Hi, everyone. Jerri and Jamie, it's a pleasure to be here. And always with my friend and colleague, Susan. I'm a former superintendent, and right now I find myself doing some consulting and speaking with Susan about our book. It's a topic, like you said, we were privileged, and it's a pleasure to actually talk with superintendents who led during COVID and who are leading now, who find themselves with several of the challenges that we both faced during COVID and the challenges that we have now during post-COVID. So, yep, we're going to dive into those topics now. And just a pleasure to be here. So thank you.
Yes. And both of you are so connected in the superintendent world and have so many connections, and you're able to collaborate so powerfully among your peers. So can you tell us a little bit about how the book got started, what you were thinking, and how you two came together to write this book?
Yeah, what's the behind the scenes to that? Curious.
Yeah.
Well, I'll kick off. I had long admired Kristi beginning when she actually before that, but really got to know her during her tenure as president of AASA during the pandemic, I might add. Right, Kristi? Was that right?
Yeah, that was right.
Yeah, pretty much. And so Kristi and I had been part of a group called Sister Soups that I know Kristi will talk about later in the context of networking. But we, were kindred spirits in so many ways. And one of those was the deep for lack of a better word, the deep love we have for the superintendency and that role and the significance of it and the great privilege that those of us who serve in that role have. And so, we both felt, as I said earlier, that there was a need to document what superintendents did for their communities during the pandemic, because we've long believed that aside from first responders and healthcare workers, superintendents were on the front lines of the pandemic in ways that I just don't think the majority of the population understands. And as the title conveys, it came at a price for many superintendents, both personal and professional. And so, and I'll turn it over to Kristi after this. It wasn't just about documenting that moment in time in history, which we believe was important in and of itself. It was also about helping to provide a more accurate picture of not just what superintendents do, but who they are. Because as we know, the challenges that superintendents have always faced during the pandemic and are facing today are not going away. And so for us to strengthen the profession and support our colleagues in that seat, we need to build a much greater understanding of who superintendents are as people and the importance of what they do.
Yeah, I would just add, well, first of all, Susan and I are really good friends. And so during COVID, much like a lot of superintendents, we had to lean on each other for strength and support. And she mentioned the sister soups, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Chapter 2 is all about informal and formal networks. So whether or not you belong to a network or of informal or formality, everybody had to reach out to their friends. Susan and I helped each other tremendously. And I know she and Matt Miller, for example, she'll talk about that as a story. We're not unique in that. But I tell you that because in context of how the book came about, she, a reporter that she had talked to her about this idea of writing a book. And I'll let Susan kind of expand on that later, but she had called me and we were talking about this again, the idea of sort of historically documenting everything that superintendents had gone through during COVID, but also just as importantly, making sure that story is resonating with the common public about what superintendents do, humanizing their role, making sure that people really have a good historical context of what happened during COVID, but in just as important, what they're doing now. And so because we had a really good relationship and we were able to talk through all kinds of things, we sort of made a commitment to each other that this is a book that has to be written. The historical perspective, the historical account, if you will, and then also just the stories of what superintendents went through. So she called me and said, I've been asked to author this book, but I need a co-author. I want somebody to write it with me. Would you be interested in doing that? And of course I said, of course I'll do it. And so we, not very many people, I think you know that we had a very, very short timeline, a 3.5 months timeline to do it. And I know that I wouldn't have been able to do it alone. And I know she has said she wouldn't. So, the strength of having a good co-author, I think in both of us, we got it done.
Yeah, I think we're both very, very clear that the book never would have come to fruition if we hadn't collaborated in the way that we did alone. It sort of goes by it's a great example of the mantra, we're better together than we are alone.
The timeline probably really pushed you to get it done. And, instead of just pushing it off, was it kind of a blessing?
The reason it was such a tight timeline is because the anniversary of 5 years was March. And so we were up against that. But I mean, yes and no. I think there's two ways to answer that. But,
right.
Having a timeline and a goal is good. But I think, looking back, we probably would want to spend some time really unpacking that question.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, Jerri, you're right. There wasn't a lot of time to procrastinate and keep pushing the deadline out. And I think in that sense, it was helpful. I think Kristi and I, given our very mild perfectionism tendencies, would have preferred to have a bit more time to, continue to revise. But that's the nature of writing.
Yeah.
It's never done. I don't think any author would tell you that a finished volume is ever really finished. They could always go back and do something else. And at some point, you just have to refuse to let the perfect be the enemy of the good and just put it out into the world. And so that's what we did.
That's so good you said that. I'm actually going through the same thing. I've been writing a book for 7 years, and it's been on and off, obviously more off. And I just got a co-author, and now the world has changed. And it really makes such a difference having a partner in this. So I totally understand what you two are saying. So what are some of those stories that you really wanted to share? I love when you said that you wanted to humanize the role. Jerri used to be a superintendent. My husband is a superintendent, and I totally get that. I mean, you are out there in the public, and parents, they don't get it often. And it's a really, really challenging thing. And so some days you are a hero, and then that can just shift in a minute. And it's so challenging. So what are some of those stories that you really knew that you had to share in this book?
Well, I think, and Kristi and I have spent obviously considerable time talking about this.
Sure.
And I've come to the realization, I think we both have, that sadly, somehow superintendents are now almost viewed as commodities first and people second. And what we mean by that is, a school board in a community feels like, okay, you're ours. And, we see really good people and leaders just being discarded for that I can see good reason. And that is such it's bad for the profession. It's bad for kids. It's bad for education writ large. But I think a lot of it stems from the fact that people see the superintendent as a role first and not a person in that role. And it's much easier to discard of a commodity, a thing, versus a person. So we've got to help the public and our communities and school boards in particular understand that these are human beings first, and that the basic fundamentals of life, treating people the way that you want to be treated, respectfully, honestly, with going in believing good intent, working to collaborate to get to yes, etc. Those things matter. And that when that reset button gets hit in leadership in our schools, it's just not good for anybody. And so this is bigger than superintendents themselves. This is really about the quality of public education on a much larger scale at a time, we would argue, that public education is more critically important and needed than it ever has been.
Yeah. I would just add that each chapter, we kind of dive into, navigating the unknown. There's lots of examples of how that was done, networking, teaching and learning, those kinds of things. And so your question about, what are the examples like? Each chapter has those examples. And then at the end, we sort of summarize in insights and takeaways. And also there's an exemplar. So there's a district that's, there's an exemplar that's highlighted for each district. And I would just also add that, I think one of the biggest lessons that is highlighted, it continues to be, is when a superintendent continues to lead with their values and is demonstrated consistently with their decisions. It can be challenging to do so, but that is why sometimes they're under fire, or they're on fire, or they get fired. Right. It's another example of why some of the newer less seasoned superintendents need mentors to help them understand the importance of leading from your values and so we kind of dive into those examples and it's a threaded throughout the chapters. So I just offer that.
Right. Exactly, because people are coming to the position so much younger and so with less experience
and less preparation in
and
many
less
cases.
Yeah.
right.
There's a lot of fear around, well, okay, so I have these values. I'm afraid that if I stick to my values, I'm going to get fired, or there's a political angle. How do I navigate all of that? And so, that's what, chapter 2 is really about the power of informal working, and finding that balance of how you navigate that world.
And, Jerri, too, when it comes to the superintendent, we talk about people coming in, a little greener, less experience, less preparation. The organization that I'm joining, the Center for Educational Leadership, talks a lot about the importance of expertise in education leadership in the classroom. I think we really need to bring back this notion of expertise to the superintendency. Just because you lead does not necessarily mean that you are equipped to serve as a superintendent. And I think we need to use that word serve very intentionally, because you are not in it for a title, a role, or a paycheck. You are there to serve children, families, and community, period, full stop. And if that is not, as Kristi said, core to your values and is not what drives you to show up every day, you need to go elsewhere.
Yeah. Right.
And to Susan's point, there's some really good examples of what that looks like and what it doesn't look like. So when you have people who have done it, and whether they've gotten fired for it or they've been under fire or there's, I really like what she said, because there's examples of it. So we can really be concrete with our newbies and show them and walk them through it. And so I think that's really important to drive the work forward.
And it is a delicate balance, because you have what does the community stand for? And what if your values are not in line with the community? That can be very difficult as well. And balancing all of that together, it's such a difficult job.
Well, and that's why I always, when I talk with aspiring superintendents, I always say, choose your professional home wisely, because aligning your values, who you are, how you lead, with the community is very important. I know who I am. I know where I stand. I know why I stand there, and I know what I'm willing to lose my job over. That drives and determines, to a large measure, where I choose to lead.
Yes.
And it rules out quite a few places. And I think that sometimes, especially new leaders, are so eager to get in the seat. And I get it. We've all been there, right? We've all been there. And I always caution them, choose wisely. Because, by the way, even choosing wisely does not guarantee it's all going to work out hunky-dory. So, but it at least gives you a fighting chance of having some longevity and success.
That's great advice. Great advice to superintendents. So how did you curate the stories that you were going to bring into the book?
Well, having kind of a wide net of relationships help.
Yes.
So we were able to, and one of the things that was really important to both Susan and I was to really have a broad sense of experiences to capture in the book, whether it was people served in rural districts or suburban districts, East Coast, West Coast, small, large. We really wanted a big sample. So Susan and I both just began reaching out to colleagues that we felt would really give us that large sample. So we got this question, a few weeks ago, and I thought it was a really good question. It was basically, did we do the work ourselves? And yes, we did. We interviewed them. We came up with the questions, and basically kind of felt like a dissertation in some respects, a qualitative dissertation. But we did that, and there were some themes that emerged from, regardless of where you served. And sometimes I think people are surprised by that, because if you're serving in a large district, inner city, urban. Sometimes it's a different setting than a rural, smaller, district in, Arizona. But anyhow, Susan and I collaborated on that list, and we captured I think there's around 40 superintendents, both former and current superintendents. The one, I think, common characteristic is that they all served during COVID.
Yes, that was sort of the one denominator. I will say, though, there's another leadership lesson embedded in this. And someone asked Kristi and me recently, like, this is an amazing group of leaders that you were able to include in the book. And, first of all, I think people need to understand that the superintendency is a very close-knit community. We're an N of 1 in our districts and in our community. So being part of the superintendent network, whether it's in your region, your state, nationally, is so important. And so when Kristi and I reached out to our colleagues, it also helps. Kristi and I have been doing this for more than a minute, so we have a lot of friends and colleagues. They were all eager to help. And I think Kristi and I were very clear with them that we felt that it was a privilege, an honor, a responsibility to share their stories, and that we were intent on getting them right. But I also think that, and I was thinking about this in retrospect after Kristi and I were asked, how did you get all these heavy hitting, busy superintendents to, give up their time? One of my lessons as I've transitioned the last year and a half out of the superintendency that has really stuck with me, and I don't think we talk about it enough, is how you go through life and how you go through your career. And when I mean how, I mean most importantly, how you treat people, how you engage with people, how you say what you mean what you say, how you follow through, how you show up for others. Because here's the thing, and this is what a lot of young leaders don't understand. At some point, you're going to need people to show up for you. Yes. And, I think that having a network and having people who will step up and say, happy to help, whatever you need, doesn't happen just out of the goodness of people's hearts. These are kind, generous, wonderful human beings. Everyone in that book is. But I think it also is a reflection of how you have treated others during your career, and that you've showed up for others so that when your time comes, they're going to show up for you. And that's just so important.
Yeah, well said.
You talk about mentoring for the less seasoned folks, but you also said that your second chapter is about networking. So regardless of your experience, it's always so important to keep those connections alive, support other people. They're also, like you said, Susan, going to support you. You're in a lone position in a district that is you are the only person who has that job. The only person who has that job. And whether it's a huge district, a small district, you need to have that support and network. I know my husband is every single day, multiple times a day, texting other superintendents in other districts. They go out for happy hour together. They are always texting and leaning on each other. They have monthly meetings. They go to the National Conference of Education together every year. You have to have that community built in, and you think you can do it alone. You have to do it with others. You really do.
I will just add what David Schuler said. He's executive director of ESA, and he wrote the foreword of the book and then was quoted kind of throughout several chapters. And he said that the superintendent job is only lonely if you want it to be, or you allow it to be, rather.
That's right.
And he's so right about that. First of all, as a new superintendent or a baby superintendent or whatever, first or second year, sometimes you're so busy trying to be a superintendent that it's really hard to take advantage of networks. So I feel pretty strongly that it's kind of incumbent upon either your state association or your national association or people like Susan and I and others to reach out to them and help them navigate it. And that's the power of mentoring, and the informal networks and things that, whether they be in state or elsewhere, really help with that, because we've all been there. done that.
Right.
So while yes, it's the end of one, I get that and I love that. It doesn't necessarily have to, you don't have to be by yourself.
Right.
So there's some really great examples in chapter 2 of, really the differences between formal and informal, and, how to, in my first year or second year, had I really taken advantage of the networking opportunities that are out there. I mean, I kind of knew, but I just think things would have been a little different for me.
Yeah.
So,
Kristi, this is like a great segue to the Sister Soups.
Susan, do you want to tell them how that started, or do you want me to tell them? Or
Yeah, I can kick off and then chime in, Kristi, since you really dove into that, in that chapter. It was Catrice Pereira, who's an amazing human being and leader, superintendent in Lancaster ISD in Texas. And, when we were in the early days of the pandemic where everyone was really locked down, she reached out to some of us and said, I can't do this alone. Like, I need people. And even though we are locked down,
Right.
we connect virtually on a regular basis. And so for a few months, we did our very best to convene every Sunday. And we did a book study on cast, but a lot of times it was just connecting and commiserating during what was just an incredibly challenging time that none of us, as prepared and expert as we were in our field, were really prepared for. So, Kristi, do you want to take it from there and how it's been going on?
I think Heidi Seif from Umatilla, Oregon, said that she would not be a superintendent if it wasn't for the Sister Soups. And I just remember there were some really delicate, heartbreaking topics covered during that time. George Floyd's murder. There was a lot of race tensions. A lot of things that none of us really, I don't think, were really prepared to handle and deal with. And a lot of trust was formed. Now, the thing about it is we don't really meet online like we did. But one of the cool things that is happening, or does happen, I should say, is whenever we go to a conference like ASA or whatever, we always text each other and say, "Hey, we're here. So and so, if whoever's around, come say hi." And so I think the bonds are just there. We'll just forever have a bond. And to this day, I know that all of us could text, call, email, and say, "Hey, could we all just jump on a Zoom call? I'm really struggling with X."
Yeah.
And we would all be there. To Susan's point, we're really, it's a solid community. And I also would say, there's a group of guys. I just know we just didn't include it in the book because tight timelines and not enough room, but who have a very similar group. And I'm sure there's all kinds of other groups that have formed. Do things like this.
And, I want to just touch on, and this would be a whole separate podcast in and of itself, but many superintendents would argue that we were dealing with a dual pandemic of COVID and the pandemic of racism, and that the racial reckoning that coincided with the pandemic really made the job of leading our districts and our communities that much more challenging. And one of the examples I'll give of Kristi sort of saying, like, we show up for each other. There's a part in the book where at one point my central office was vandalized and somebody spray painted racist superintendent across the front entrance of the district in like blood red paint and splattered, red paint all over the place. And I remember I had shared that story, I think, with the Sister Soups, as a group that Sunday or whenever it was. And Martha Salazar Zamora, again, fabulous person and leader who is the superintendent in Tomball ISD in Texas, just called me like out of the blue and just said, "I'm just checking on you." And I think that that's another leadership lesson that, I'm going to call and check up on Kristi after this and make sure she's like healthy, because the woman is, again, when I see my friend, but this notion of checking in on one another and just that outreach. And I think that people underestimate how much it means and how sustaining it can be in the job in those tough moments to know that you're not alone and that you have real support and friendship from those that you work with.
That's a great point. And that you're being seen by someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Someone else sees you and sees what's going on. Susan, I have heard you say that you've called and checked it on different people. Like after the Uvalde, I think you were saying you checked in. I just remember hearing you say that. So that must have had a big impact on you too.
Well, and, you know, I think too, you know, I went through a very challenging period about a year and a half ago, probably the most challenging period of my professional career. And I'll just give the example of Kristi, and I almost get choked up every time I tell this story, but this woman picked up the phone whenever I called. And I remember one time I called her and we had talked for like 15 minutes, and I'm sure I was completely apoplectic about something. And finally she's like, and finally I heard something in the background. I'm like, where are you? She's like, oh, we're in Hawaii. Or they were on vacation. And she still picked up. And I'm like, oh my God, don't pick up my call while you're on vacation. But that's what it was. But it also wasn't just my reaching out. It was like her checking in, just saying, look, leaving a message, a text. Like, if you don't feel like talking, that's okay. But just a reminder, I'm here. Like, those moments are just everything when you're in the thick of it. So,
Well, but I will pay it forward to Susan. She wrote the chapter on creating a culture of care for students and staff and families, right? And so we learned, and everybody learned how to do that, right? Because we just navigated that during COVID. And I think that when you model that, you commit to yourself, obviously, to really put that into practice. So for me, as a friend and a colleague, that was one example, was to be there for my friend. But also as a leader in your district, and there's examples. Susan wrote that chapter. It's a chapter. You have to, again, you have to model it. Then you have to put that into daily practice. Otherwise, it's all for nothing. You hear about the gratitude and all the self-care things that we all tried to make sure we were doing during COVID. But for some of us, it comes naturally, sure. And others, it doesn't. But it does make a big difference in how you live your life, and it goes back to what Susan talked about in terms of service. And the superintendents who I think are effective leaders are the ones who go back to why they are in the role to begin with. And their true value is of service. And that, it's not about you. It's about serving others and giving back. So kind of a lot of things to say there, but it's, picking up the phone when someone calls and needs you.
Yeah, I think that giving back is so important. I think this organization is really essential because there are, first of all, when you're in a rural area, you have, bigger districts. There aren't as many superintendents around regionally. And if there are, they're more likely than not going to be men anyway, which I think we all can agree. I've had amazing male mentors, but it's quite another opportunity to have female mentors, female network.
Different dynamics.
It's a different dynamic. Absolutely. And so like when I was talking about my husband's group of, male and female people who they really rely on, we're in New Jersey. We have superintendents just, a half mile away, different districts. So here, when you're talking about nationally, it's a much, much more bigger challenge. So I think.
And Jamie, I also just want to say too, we are living in a moment where the notion of affinity groups is coming under attack.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important that we use this moment to educate, inform, and enlighten. And that we use every platform we have to say affinity groups aren't about exclusion.
Right.
They are about the fact that we have a human need to sometimes come together and be with people who are having a similar experience to ours. Now, that is not exclusive. I want to be in a room with people who aren't like me too, right? That's how we get better. But we all have that moment, whether it's a group of women superintendents coming together, whatever it may be. But there is a power and a necessity in affinity groups. And I think we need to keep talking about that, because we can't afford for those to go away. Because for people in leadership roles in particular, the reality is that, I love my husband. He's like the greatest guy on the planet. He's an engineer and he's brilliant at it.
Right.
He doesn't understand what I'm going through as a superintendent. He definitely also doesn't understand what I'm going through as a woman in the superintendency.
Yes.
I need people like Kristi, who, is a fellow woman in the superintendency, for me to touch base with sometimes. My husband serves a very different purpose, right, in terms of how he supports me and I bounce ideas off him. But that notion of having safe affinity spaces, we need to continue to champion that and make sure that it doesn't become misconstrued,
Right.
and that people somehow feel that they can't do that, because it will be a loss.
It would be a huge loss.
So
Yeah, they have
eloquently
those spaces.
said.
Yeah.
So eloquently said. We had affinity groups in our district, and so many people were outraged by it because they felt they were being excluded from it. I love what you said. I wish I would have had those talking points. That was beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
So what is
Yes.
one thing that you are hoping that readers are going to walk away with? At least one. What is the most important to you? And it might be chapters that are, came from your heart. So you may have different answers here, but what are your thoughts?
Go, Kristi.
Yeah, thanks. I hope people walk away feeling inspired. I really, that's the word that comes to mind for me. I hope they read it and they, are, again, the whole point was to historically sort of just provide that historical context of what happened.
Right.
But Susan kind of kids me. She jokes with me and says, "Oh, she's Pollyanna," in the pair. But it's important to me that people understand and remember. For me, being a superintendent, I loved the role. I absolutely loved it. But I also want people to understand what the role is. And I love what Susan reminds me of, and our readers and audience, that we're humans. And so I want people to walk away feeling really inspired that they can do the job with the help of the mentors and people like all of us on the call. But inspired is the word that really comes to my mind, and what I want them to feel and think about.
I would agree with that. And by the way, I am very pro Pollyanna-ish. I think we could all use a little bit more. I know this is a quick segue, Jerri, but people talk about hope is not a strategy, which I get. But hope is essential to get out of bed these days and execute on your strategy. So don't minimize the importance of hope and optimism. But I think that building on this notion of inspiration, I also hope that our readers take away the importance of leadership as service above self. For those of us that have embraced that throughout our careers, it's a duh.
Right.
Right.
But I believe that we are living in a moment where that is not being exemplified or modeled for us at the national level, the state level. And I think some of the best examples of leadership as service that we are seeing today is happening in our school systems. And so what I hope people take away is, yes, the inspiration that comes from the fact that there are people showing up every day in the face of tremendous challenge to do right by our children and to continue to make sure that we deliver on the promise of public education, because we simply have to.
Oh, well said.
True.
Well
So
said.
true.
That's beautiful.
Love it. Love it. Love it.
Well, as we kind of bring this plane into land, let's talk about quickly, what is it as a mentor that you could say globally to our young leaders that are coming in? Do you have any piece of advice, words of wisdom? What might you say to them?
So I'll start, and Kristi can just start making her grocery list in her head, because she's probably heard me say this so many times now. One of the things that I always come back to when people ask about advice, and, is I would often get the question, as I'm sure Kristi did, as I'm sure you all have over the course of your career, do you love your job? And of course, initially I would always say, oh yeah, of course. Yeah, blah, blah, it's great. And then, because I really strive not to be a hypocrite, I realized I wasn't being totally honest.
Right.
Most of the time I love my job, but not all the time. And so I started saying this. Most days I love my job, but I make a clear distinction between the job and the work. The job is the politics, the attacks, the toxicity, the mundane, all of the crap, for lack of a better word.
Right.
But the work of serving children and families is a gift, even on the hardest day. And so we endure the job for the sake of the work. And I think that distinction helped me on those really hard days. And I think that any superintendent, any leader will tell you, like, those moments where you're like, and I'm done.
Yeah.
And then you get a message from a parent, or you walk into a classroom and kids come rushing up to you and you're like, oh, I'm sucked back in again.
Right.
So it's that notion of staying focused on the work that I think keeps you in it for the long haul.
What a great distinction.
Perfect.
That's powerful.
Yeah, so all of that. And then I'm going to give some practical advice, just really concrete. So if you're new to the role, and really if you're changing districts and you're a superintendent, I think some really key practical advice. One is exercise and eat well. It's really important. If you aren't doing those things, it's just you can start anytime. Just make sure you're exercising and you're eating well. That'll help you sleep well too. So those are really important. And the other thing is, I personally think that if you do not have a mentor or an executive coach or friend outside of your district area, and now that's just my opinion and my advice, and you should. It just kind of like, it doesn't, I mean, you can find one in your state. My expertise and my experiences has been that it's really helpful just to build your expertise and your knowledge outside of your state. So that would be my number 2. Find somebody outside of your comfort zone, basically, and build your own knowledge and kind of skills.
Outside your affinity group, Kristi?
Well, health and state is really what I'm talking about. And then my third one is really basically for your brand new superintendent. And it goes to what Susan was talking about. Don't necessarily take the first job that you see. Like when you're job hunting and you're just so set on, I have to be a superintendent. And I know everyone has heard this, but it's really important now. Remember, you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you.
Yes, exactly. That fit has to be right. Yes. And Kristi, when you talked about finding someone outside of your state, do you have any advice about how to do that? That's maybe difficult for people to.
Well, one of the things that people can do is the AASA has the Aspiring Superintendent Program.
Yes.
So you can join that.
Those
and they'll match you with a mentor. That's out. Most likely it's outside your state, or you can request one.
Your state association can help you with that. They might match you with an in-state, but you can, because there's people outside of your state that's connected. So I would say start with AASA. Valerie Truesdell is the person that they would contact, and they will help you. And then your state association will help you too.
It is such a big deal. I know that when my husband was being mentored almost 20 years ago, that is the one thing that he was told was if you have to go to one conference every year, it needs to be through the ASA, National Conference of Education. Those are your people. That is your organization. You need to make sure that you are going to that every year. And so this is the first year where so many others in our county are going this year. But there were only a handful that went every year. But he made sure every year he was going, and now he's bringing others along too. So it really is a wonderful experience to be people from all over the country and just hear whether big, small, we all have similar pain points. We're all in the same work. And
a lot
serving
of networking opportunities.
Students, yeah, right, yes. And then, of course, being able to connect with all those people afterward and continue. It is wonderful. It is wonderful.
It is. This has been such a great conversation because it's been at a deeper level. I appreciate both of you, your expertise, as we were talking about earlier. But not only that, it's your wisdom. Your wisdom runs deep, and I appreciate that from both of you. I was blessed to be at one of your book signings, and you are right. The rock star superintendents that showed up for you was incredible and impressive. And I felt blessed to be there and to witness that. And I want to say thank you for writing.
Hosting. And we're grateful that you and your hubby, Jerri, it's always great to see him too, that you could be a part of that. Thank you so much. It was a great evening.
It was a wonderful evening, yes. But thank you most of all for writing this book and putting it out there so that others can learn from that and the wisdom of not just both of you, but the wisdom of all of your colleagues in the book as well.
Thanks.
So thank you, ladies. And I hope lots of people pick up a copy of your book because it is great. It's a good one to learn from.
So much.
You bet.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.